Welcome to the Blind Zone, where curiosity brings its own reward. What am I curious about today? Well, I'm curious about how the pattern of the Bible fits so that we can have a better understanding. And before I start, I have to say that when I had classes at Dallas Theological Seminary, I learned this from the professor, Dr. Mark Yarborough. So I want to say that so that I'm not committing verbal plagiarism. Anyway, when he taught this, I said to myself, if I'd have known this earlier, it would have changed a lot of things about how I read and understood my Bible. Now, in this episode, I'm going to do this in two parts. This is going to be the Old Testament pattern of the Bible. And then next, the following week, I'm going to do the New Testament pattern of the Bible. And he taught us this pattern, and it stuck with me. And I've taught it to every women's small group that I've ever had because I find it so instrumental. Well, let's talk about the Bible as a whole to begin with. The Bible was written over about 1,500 years, and there's 66 books in it, and it's authored by about 40 or more authors. That's important, but it's more important to recognize that it was really written by the Holy Spirit through these people. So if you take out your Bible and you open to the table of contents and you look at the Old Testament selection, I'm going to give you a pattern, and I'd like you to write this down at the top of your page. The numbers 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. And I'll tell you what they indicate and why they're important. So the first 5 books are called the Pentateuch, the Book of the Law, or the Book of Moses, but they encapsulate Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This sets a precedence for the rest of the book. Now, most of the books will describe what is inside of the book, and like Genesis is no different. Genesis is in the opening statement says what it is, in the beginning, God. So Genesis is about the beginning and the 7 days of creation and what God did during those 7 days and even on his day of rest on the seventh. In this chapter, it's 50 chapters, but there's lots of stuff that happens. And I will say, I never really encourage people to start reading the Bible from the beginning to the end because Genesis is fun and Exodus is an interesting story. But if you don't understand what Leviticus is, you get really bogged down in the whole leprosy, pustules and going to see the priest and all that stuff. So in the book of Genesis, though, we will see the creation, like I said, the 7 days of creation. God makes Adam and then he makes the helpmate Eve. But by the third chapter, they get into trouble. There's a serpent and he tells a lie to Eve because, again, the serpent is the evil one and he wants to kill, steal, and destroy. So he says to Eve, did God really say? And that starts a pattern of behavior because she heard what he said. It sounded plausible. And she took the fruit and ate it, and their eyes were opened because had been forbidden to eat from the tree of the fruit, the tree from the, they were not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but they did, and it all changed for them. So in this chapter, then, we see that havoc is wreaked and that God says enough of this, and he wipes out everybody but Noah, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, and he floods the world, and Noah's on a boat. But when Noah gets off the boat after the flood is ended and the ground is dried, Noah still brings with him the same sin heart nature that he entered the ark with. So he steps out, and God told him, now I want you to scatter and go amidst, all the places. But they don't. They stay, and God says, well, we can't have this disobedience. Now keep in mind, the book of Genesis takes about probably an hour to read, but this is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in the making. So in this chapter, we're going to see, God's creation, Adam and Eve, Noah, the flood, and God decides then he's going to bring up a people all of his own, and he's going to use a man called Abram, and his name is later changed to Abraham. And again, there's so much detail that I could spend the next hour telling you just about Genesis, but I need to move through this. So we'll meet Abraham and his wife, Sarah. They have a son, Isaac. Isaac will have a son. He'll have two sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob will go on and have 12 more sons, and Jacob will have the 12 tribes of Israel. So there'll be the 12 tribes of Israel that will be had. And one of the key people of the 12 is his son Joseph. And he will bring his people out of a famine thanks to the provision of God. And so lots of fun stories in Genesis, lots of things to learn. And even back in the beginning of Genesis, around Genesis 12, he will tell Abraham that his people will be enslaved for 400 years. And so the period between Genesis and Exodus, there is a 400-year period in which we don't hear anything from God. The next book is Exodus, and now the Israelites are no longer favored. They're now enslaved by the Egyptians because of their volume. The Pharaoh decided he wasn't gonna let them to just continue to prosper. So God finds Moses, and he says to Moses, go to the Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. And this is another fabulous story. So lots of plagues, lots of things happen, and the people eventually are let go by Pharaoh, and they go out. Again, tons more in that story, but I'm just giving you the brevity of it. So at the end of Exodus, by this time, the enslaved people are let free, and they're in the wilderness. And what would have taken an 11-day journey now takes 40 years. But we don't find out about that until we get to the book of Numbers. But in Leviticus, God realized that he needed to set some rules and standards, because up to this point, they had been enslaved, and they were looking and listening to other people telling them what it is they should be doing. So with their freedom, God knew that they also needed some restrictions so that they knew how to act and what God was expecting of them. So that's the book of Leviticus. Now, in the book of Numbers, we find out that the Numbers is two censuses that was given. The first was a census of the people who left Egypt. They then decided that God wasn't going to tell them the truth, and they rebelled. And so God said, that's fine. If you don't want to enter the promised land, which is the whole purpose when when God told Abraham that he would give them people a land of their own, he said, fine. So they wandered around until all the people who originally left Egypt died. So who was left was the second census, was all the children of the people who had left. So the only two people that did not rebel was Joshua and Caleb. And Joshua, Caleb, and the new people, or the children of the original Israelites, will then enter into the promised land. That's really important to remember that. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, that's a second retelling of the law. So it's basically Exodus, which was told to the original Israelites that were freed from slavery in Egypt. This is the second set of people that wandered, but God needs to tell them exactly what he told their parents. So he retells them the Ten Commandments and why Moses is in charge. And Moses does a very good job of reiterating what he had told their parents previously. But neither Moses or Aaron will enter the promised land. So he gives them the why for and what they should expect. And as my seminary professor said, that if you understand the book of Deuteronomy and the blessings and cursing chapter 26 through 28, every time there's a problem with the Israelites in the Old Testament, if you look up what their problem was, you can find a direct correlation to what it was said about them in Deuteronomy 28. For instance, Solomon went back to Egypt and took chariots and horses, but that was condemned as being what would be cursed if that was done. It was done, and it was cursed, so there's no surprise with that. So that's Deuteronomy. That's the law, the book of Moses, and the Pentateuch. But now we're standing on the cusp. The people have heard everything, and they are now prepared to enter the promised land. The next 12 books are the historically theological books, and they start with Joshua and end with Esther. In these books, like Joshua has led the people across the Jordan into the promised land, and he gives them favor, but they have to wipe out a lot of people because there's some people living in the land that are not going to be followers. And in fact, they're going to be a thorn in their side if they don't get rid of them. The next book is Judges. And God has seen that after Joshua is going to die, that people aren't just going to follow the priests and the Levites, which they were told to do back in Leviticus. So he sets up a series of judges to help these people. But if you read the book of Judges, you'll see that some were good, some were not good, and some were very bad. And at the end of Judges, it says very clearly, and the people did what was good and right in their own eyes, which was not up to God's standard. But the book of Ruth is also set in the time of Judges, but Ruth does what God has asked. She has a mother-in-law, Naomi, and they go through a series of hardships, and they go back to their hometown of Bethlehem, and Ruth meets a kinsman redeemer named Boaz, and she and Ruth have a child, and that child is in the lineage of King David. The next book is 1st and 2nd Samuel, and now because God saw that the judges were not going to be effective, he now gave them prophets. And Samuel is the first prophet and the last judge. And in this book, we see that the people have said, we want a king like everybody else. And Samuel tells them very clearly that if they persist with this and get a king, that all these bad things are going to happen. But they clamor anyway and say, we want a king. So they look around and they find a king that they think would be helpful for their good. And they pick out a man named Saul. And Samuel is clearly upset because that's not what God says, because God says, I am your king, just follow me, but they're not interested. So Saul starts straight and he does fairly well in the beginning, but he quickly falls into severe problems, and they find out that Saul is not the man for the job. But in the meantime, God brings up somebody that he knows will be the next king that he has picked. Because again, Saul was somebody that people picked, but David will be the king that God alone picks. And he was claimed to be a man after God's own heart. So 1st and 2nd Samuel cover the period of the first couple kings that they had, King Saul, King David, and then David's son, Solomon. The next book is the 1st and 2nd Kings, and they talk about the kings after Saul, David, Solomon, and after Solomon had a son called Rehoboam. And Rehoboam did some foolish things, and that's when the kingdom was divided. So you had 10 tribes that went to the north, and you had 2 tribes that stayed in the south. And God said, because of Rehoboam's wickedness, that the kingdom would be divided and would be forever separate. So what's interesting about this is the kings that the northern tribes pick are all people that they have chosen. They're not priests or Levites. And so all of their kingdom, all of the kings in the north, all are bad kings. There's not one good king in the north. Now in the south, you have a few good kings, but again, they don't do what they should do either. So moving on from that, then we get to so the book of Kings is chronicling all that. Then you come to 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now this is for the Chronicles are chronicling only the southern kingdoms, and it's mostly the spiritual side and not what the kings had done, because that was laid out in 1st and 2nd Samuel and the book of Kings. The books after that are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and they are books that cover a period after, when the people need to know certain things after they're exiled, and you don't even find out about the exile until a little later. So you stop there at Esther, and each of these books, again, is the historically theological books. So we'll stop with those for a minute. The next 5 is considered wisdom literature, and the book of Job is considered the oldest book of the Bible. And after that, you have Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And those are all wisdom literature, and they're written by a number of different authors, King David and Solomon. And those are important books, but they hold some history, but it's mostly, again, wisdom literature. The next 5 books after that are the major prophets, and these start with Isaiah and end with Daniel. And they're not major because of they're major in their importance, but they're also major in their volume, because the next 12 books after that are called the minor prophets. And again, they're not minor because they're less valuable. It's just because they say less in a shorter amount of time. In fact, it's probably figured that the 12 minor prophets all were on the same scroll, and when they were put into the Old Testament, they were then divided up into 12 individual books. Now, what you need to know about the major and minor prophets is a key factor before I describe why it's important. During the time of the kingdoms in the north and in the south, God kept telling them through the prophets that they were going to be taken over if they didn't shape up. And they had huge problems with idolatry and other evil, sinful things that they did. And God told them, if you don't shape up in the north, I'm going to send the Assyrians in to take over, and you'll be scattered and you'll never be coming back. In the south, God sent prophets that told the south the same thing. And he said, if you don't shape up, I'm going to send the Babylonians in to straighten you up, because you too are struggling with idolatry. So in the book of the prophets, there are 5 prophets that talk to the people before they were exiled. Then a number of them are talking to the people after they were exiled, because the northern kingdom is taken over by the Assyrians. They're taken off and they never recover. A few of them might scatter, but as a tribal Israelite tribes, they're never seen or heard from again. And so their act of idolatry was the thing that ruined them. In the south, they too were dragged off, but it was a couple hundred years later. But again, they too fell into the problem with idolatry, and they were taken off by the Babylonians. So in the prophets, you see pre-exile, before they were taken off, the exiled prophets talking to both the north and the south, what happened during each of those adventures, and then after they were returned back from exile. And so that's where Ezra and Nehemiah come in, and they tell you what happened, and when the people come back, what it was they did to rebuild, because at this point the temple is destroyed. Now, the important thing to remember is the book of 5, the book of the law, sets up the rest of the Old Testament. But the next 12 books, the historically theological books, are filled out when you then move to the next books of the 5 wisdom literature, the 5 major prophets, and the 12 minor prophets. And you pick them up and you back them up and you put them on top of the 12 historically theological books, and they fill out that story. Because in the past, I had always thought of the books of the Bible like it was just one big log and rubber band that stretched and stretched and stretched. But once I saw how they interfaced and folded in with each other to fill out what the prophets had said, it made so much more sense to me. So again, that's it. It's 5, 12, 5, 5, 12, why they're important, how they fit together. And anyway, I think this has been helpful for me. And when I teach it to other people who might not be as familiar, when they do read the major or minor prophets, they now have an understanding. Because again, God sent a deliverer in the way of Moses to get them out of Egypt. He then sent priests and Levites to tell them the law so they could follow it. He then sent judges to correct them. He then sent prophets to fix them. And then he finally sent in Assyrians and Babylonians to take them off until they learned their lesson. So that's it for the Old Testament. And then next week, I will do the New Testament, where we'll also see a pattern that I think is very helpful for an understanding, because the book is one whole thing, but it's filled up with 66 books that all tell the story of who God is and why Jesus came. So I hope that was helpful, and we'll see you next week on The Blind Zone.